All right, well, hello and welcome to CEC's live webinar, introducing the updated high leverage practices for students with disabilities. We have with us Dr. Tisa Aceves and Dr. Michael Kennedy, who are two of the many contributing authors. So I will now turn it over to them to get us started.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for making time on this afternoon to learn a little bit about the new high leverage practices, not new, but our refreshed high leverage practices. And we're very excited to talk about this with you all. And as I said in the chat, if you have questions as we're presenting, please put them in. Tisa and I will monitor. And as we can, we'll address them throughout. But if you have some questions, we may leave till the end. Go ahead, Tisa. So I'll introduce myself and then Tisa can do her. Here we are at CEC with the new book. This was very exciting to see this come to fruition. But I'm Michael Kennedy. I'm professor of special education at UVA. And Tisa?
Hi, I'm Tisa Aceves. I'm a professor in the School of Education at Loyola Marymount University, previous special education teacher and current co-director of the school psychology program at LMU.
Awesome. So as you know from being here today on the next slide, it is out. You can get your hands on the result of months of work that builds on the, thank you, whoever did that, builds on the previous HLPs. And all of these folks that you can see here contributed to this project. So this was absolutely a multi-site collaborative effort. Our names are at the top line as the editors, and we wrote some of this as well, but all of these folks here, these experts and policymakers, got some practitioners, everybody here did such a good job lending their knowledge and talents. Go ahead, Tisa. So you may know the HLPs as originally created were these 22 high leverage practices. And many thought that this was a heavy lift. Go ahead, Tisa, to the next one. So we've had 10 years of the HLPs, and we've learned some things since they were originally created. And a lot of people have asked us, why did we make these changes? Which is the next slide, Tisa, please. So what was the rationale for why we did this? And on the next slide is one of the first ones, and it's what I just referenced, that it was such a heavy lift because we're so good generally in PD, in teacher education. We're good at building declarative and procedural knowledge. That's what is it? What are the steps? We're pretty good at that. You know, being able to recognize new things and talk about them. But underneath the tip of the iceberg is the conditional knowledge. And that's the how to, when, under what circumstances, with whom, much, much more difficult. And when you have 22 practices, that's a big ask on the next slide for teacher preparation and in professional development. It's so many to get through. And so on the next slide, we talked about just cognitive load of teachers, not just teachers, but of all educators and of faculty trying to get through all of this content. And we recognized that when you rush to do more, you ultimately end up with less. Because when you cover things that don't go very deep, or if you go wide but not deep, you don't have that conditional knowledge that's needed. Go ahead, Tisa. Well, you know what happens to teachers when they are overwhelmed cognitively. That's when they stop using evidence-based practices. That's when they stop using high leverage practices. As faculty, when we get overloaded during presentations, that's when you can always tell when someone has talked about an issue many, many times versus when they're doing something for the very first time. And so our efforts, go ahead, Tisa, please, is to really think about what is the core of these key practices that we want to be in the repertoire of all of our colleagues around the country and be the thrust within teacher preparation programs. So how do we streamline? Because amongst the HLPs as they were written, there was a decent amount of overlap and redundancy. And examples of that are adaptations, scaffolded supports, and using assistive instructional tech. You could make an argument that the calculator that we teach a kid to use as a scaffolded support, well, that's an adaptation. And a calculator is an example of assistive or instructional technology. But you could make the other configurations of arguments as well. Like all of these things are adaptations, all of these things are scaffolds, and so much of what we do these days would qualify as assistive or instructional tech. So we're trying to bring some streamlining. And on the next slide, we really, when we wrote the originals, the team I was there, and we sort of said, who wants to be on collaboration, who wants to be on behavior, who wants to be on instruction, who wants to be on assessment. And we went to 4 different rooms, and we came back together at the end like, hey, what did you guys come up with? And that was the list. We didn't give a lot of thought at that time to how these HLPs work together, how they support one another, and really importantly, how they interface with evidence-based practice and other practices. Now, what's great is that they did work together. They did support one another. They do interface with evidence-based practices. So the committee did a great job, as I must say. But this time we really thought very strategically and across practices to deliver a really cohesive message. The next one, please. We also learned in the last 10 years that many schools and states and others asking for training and for support in this domain is we really only asked, a lot of them only ask for certain practices. Like they keep asking for explicit instruction, feedback, goals, HLP 1, collaborate with colleagues. And like this handsome young man picking the cookies, that's sort of what we said is, well, there really are ones that have risen to the top as most valuable practices. The big thing on the next slide that we didn't do a very good job of is we didn't focus enough on culturally focused pedagogies. It was there for those that know culturally focused pedagogies well. When this is your life, this is your domain, this is your area, you could see the connections and then integrate them with the HLPs. But if you were somebody who was like me at the time, who's not expert in these spaces, I am much more so now, but at that time I wasn't. I didn't think about this at all. And I would just read the text as it was written. And this really critical content sort of was lost on me. And I know it was lost on a lot of people too. So now it's very much at the fore. You can't get further than the first chapter without finding content specifically about this. This is interwoven into every chapter to help our colleagues around the country know more and do better when it comes to this. And Tisa will say more in a moment. Another thing we didn't really emphasized well in the original was the importance of elementary versus secondary applications of the HLPs. Again, you could read into it and pull out the knowledge you needed to say, what would this look like at elementary? What would this look like at secondary? But in this new edition of the book, this is called out for you, and we make very specific exemplars to scaffold. And then finally for me, and then I'll hand over to Tisa, is we really got nailed to the wall again about research and how much research support was there in front geez, how much research support was there for these practices. And there is some there's more, some there's different types of research in terms of design, but we were much more deliberate in terms of making the research known in this updated version. So I'll hand off to Tisa, who will then, who's now going to talk about, given these changes and these issues, what did we do? Take it away.
So what did we do? We did a lot. And to begin with, we did exactly what Michael was prefacing, was really identify those most valuable practices that seem to cut across, practices of interest, practices that really take the lead in honing beginning teachers' practice. And so those are called out as pillar practices across the HLPs. Not to say that we removed HLPs, not to say that other practices aren't important, but 6 particular practices really rose to the top as being critical to beginning teacher practice and training. In our view, again, as Michael indicated earlier, that depth in this case is more important than breadth, at least at first, when you're training teachers. Again, thinking of the overwhelming nature of training and education in the beginning, everything is new, so it can be overwhelming. So picking those essential practices and going deeper at first, and then building more knowledge over time. An example of that is explicit instruction, really honing that mastery of practice of explicit instruction can then impact multiple areas and be complemented by other HLPs and evidence-based practices, and making it easier to implement once those essential critical HLPs are mastered. So again, prioritizing is what we were doing, prioritizing those practices that we found to be most critical for success, that upon that you would then have a strong foundation of practice and work towards automaticity of those essential practices, and then connect those practices to other high leverage practices that are very important. And then those are the embedded practices, the other essential, critical, high leverage practices that support the pillar practices and other evidence-based practices. And we define these throughout the book, both what pillar practices are and what embedded practices are, so that it's clear, regardless of the chapter that you're reading, that you understand the difference and how they complement one another and work together. So in education, we really favor visual images to help really anchor our understanding of new concepts. And so this was a wonderful image that was developed in collaboration between CEC and CEDAR to really drive home the domains of practice, those 4 domains of practice, the 6 pillars, and then the embedded practices that support those pillar practices. And then the other piece, the infusion of culturally inclusive pedagogies and practices, not just in that introduction of the book, which is really critical and foundational to read, but it's infused throughout the text, throughout our the HLPs, not necessarily in just specific sections of the text, but woven in the examples, in the research summations that are provided really throughout the text. Here we were very intentional to hit home that you have to think of culture, language, inclusive pedagogies and practices when you're thinking of any of the HLPs in its implementation. So what didn't we change? So to be clear, we still have the 22 HLPs. Of course, there could have been more, there could have been less, but we maintain the 22. We maintain the title of the high leverage practices, but the actual descriptions of the practices in most instances, the description of the practices were updated. That doesn't necessarily mean you would do away with the descriptions from the original text, but we did enhance and adjust most of the descriptions. In some cases, they stayed the same, and then again, the labels of the HLPs remain the same with just some adjustments. And so that's something to keep in mind as you're reviewing the text. We have 4 new domains, or kind of new domains from before. We have maintained collaboration. We have data-driven planning, instruction, and the intensification of instruction for students in need of additional support. So as a comparison, we have the old domain of collaboration and now the new domain of collaboration with an adjustment. So the first pillar practice, this domain has 2 pillar practices and 1 embedded practice. So the first pillar practice is collaborate with professionals to increase student success. Here we know that collaboration is essential. We can't work alone in the work that we do. We are more effective as educators when we are tapping into the expertise of all who are in the room, and really leaning on that cross-pollination, so to speak. But in order to collaborate with professionals, you also need to know how to run an effective meeting, which is the HLP2 from the original text. It doesn't mean that we've eliminated HLP2. It's just considered an embedded practice that supports the pillar practice of collaborating with professionals as well as with families, which I'm going to highlight in a moment. We still maintain collaboration with families as being a necessary pillar practice. In order to be an effective educator, we need to really partner with families in a very intentional way, not just having them necessarily at the meeting. And that's the way we collaborate. We have to lean in. We have to make information accessible. We need to provide opportunities for families to really engage in a meaningful way. And to do that, we also need to know how to run an effective meeting and make sure that we invite families in intentional ways to participate, see them as experts, provide information that's flexible and in their language and in their primary language. So again, here we have an HLP2 that is an embedded practice supporting the pillar practice of collaborating with families. And so again, here we have that image, that graphic from this particular section of the text for domain 1, collaboration. This section or this domain and the section of the text on collaboration was led by Bonnie Billingsley from Virginia Tech and her writing team. Again, trying to reinforce those two pillar practices of HLP1, HLP3, with the embedded practices of organizing and facilitating effective meetings. Okay, our next domain previously was assessment, now is refreshed as domain 2, data-driven planning. And so data-driven planning is about using data, essentially, it's HLP6, using data to make decisions and adjustments when needed. But in order to do this, you need to access information from multiple data sources. You need to make sure that you are using clear language for all who are your partners. It could be educational professionals, it could be families, it could be community partners, and making sure that that information is accessible and clear, that you use that data to identify short-term and long-term goals and contribute to designing instruction. So all of these complement one another to support the pillar practice of HLP6. So in looking at the image for data-driven planning, we have that single HLP6, for assessing data, using assessment data and analyzing instructional practices. And then we have the multiple embedded HLPs, again, driving home that you need it all. You need that integration to be effective. Here, Kina Cornelius from the University of Florida led this particular section of the text. And I will send it over to Michael to go over domain 3.
Thanks, Tisa. So this is one of the changes. We said, okay, we have a whole domain for social, behavioral, emotional, but all of the practices within that, 3 of the 4 of that old domain, these are things we're teaching kids to do. We're teaching social behaviors. We're using feedback, academic and behavior specific. We are teaching how to create a logical, organized learning environment, and then functional behavioral assessments and behavior support plans. So we said, let's take 3 of those and put them in a new domain titled Instruction for Behavior and Academics, and take the intensive functional behavior improvement plan and move that down the line into the 4th and final domain for Intensify for All. So go ahead, Tisa. So in this new domain, we broke into 2 groups because this still has the most practices of all of them. What to teach and how to teach. In terms of the what to teach, go ahead to the next one. The pillar practice here is explicit instruction, HLP 16. This is still the loud part. This is what we see as being core to teacher practice, and we want all teachers to utilize this because you use explicit instruction and its component pieces to go across all of the rest of these HLPs that we'll talk about today, sort of as the backbone of instruction. Go ahead. So I use explicit instruction to teach social behaviors, teach specific learning strategies and other strategies, and I teach kids how to generalize learning across time and settings. At the core of each of those, these are specific things that I'm teaching to kids, but I'm using this one skill of using explicit instruction to do it. Go ahead. It's also critical that we teach kids how we want them to behave. We're creating a respectful, organized, and responsive learning environment, HLP 7, which is a pillar practice. You're not going to get very far without an organized and responsive classroom. But to achieve that, you are using these various embedded high leverage practices from the Instruction for Academic and Behavior for All domains. Go ahead, please. So embedded in the how to teach practices are promoting student engagement, making adaptations, providing scaffolded supports, using flexible groupings, using instructional and assistive tech, and providing high quality feedback. All of these are all wrapped up. These interact with one another in very specific ways. I'm actually in the midst right now of creating a new video series for you and for the field to use. And as I'm filming teachers, I'm really asking them to focus on these overlaps so that we're not thinking about these practices just sort of dangling out there all by themselves, because they really don't. They all come together in very unique and interesting ways. And that's one of the themes that we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation and will be a theme of presenting. And let me put in a plug for that while I'm making a plug about it. If you're an administrator or a state leader or you're a teacher yourself, and you know somebody who's really good at implementing these practices and from the full list, and you think that they would be willing to be featured, I'm really doing all I can to feature diverse teachers and students using every definition of that word, meaning I'm leaving my area code in order to film teachers. So if you have somebody or know somebody, or you are somebody that would be willing, please send me an email and I will get in touch with you about maybe coming out to film. So there's that. Go ahead, Tisa. This section was led by Paula Lancaster, who's dean at Central Michigan University, and we had a huge group because it had so many practices. We had quite a bit of real estate to cover. Go ahead, please. The final domain is to intensify and intervene when needed. This is where we in special education really shine. All of these practices are intended to be used by all teachers, all educators. But when it comes to intensification, this is where the specialized knowledge of special educators, reading specialists, school psychologists, and others really comes through and shine. Go ahead, Tisa. So when we talk about providing intensive instruction, which was the old HLP 20, we expanded it so that we would say we're going to provide intensive instruction for academics and behavior, because this is going to mean smaller groups. This is going to mean more intensive instruction. But think about it. To do this, you're collaborating with colleagues. You're identifying with family members what students need. You're using various data sources and making data-driven decisions. You've already used explicit instruction and a range of other practices to figure out where is this kid academically and where are the limitations. And then you're using more of the combinations of practices to do this. These are the kinds of analyses and cross-pollination of the practices that you'll find in the new text. Go ahead. The final HLP is HLP 10, to conduct functional behavioral assessments and to individualize behavior plans. Go ahead. This section was led by Dr. Lindsay Hayes from AIR, and we had a great group of folks that are really knowledgeable about intensification here. All right, let's head to the end. So I do the summary and then you do, right?
Yeah, could I mention one thing from the previous slide, Michael?
Yeah, go ahead.
When I mentioned that there's some slight name difference or change in the HLP name, HLP 20 is the one I'm thinking about. This is the one that, as Michael said, we added instruction for academics and behavior. So this was just one example of the two where there was a name change to the HLP.
Thank you. All right, so in summary, go ahead. We have provided for you what we hope you agree is a streamlined focus on flag in the sand key practices amongst key practices. These pillar practices, if you have to make hard decisions about where should we start, if I've got a group of teachers that are brand new, they're currently alive, but they've also been hired to work in your school, what can I get them to help them support? If I've got a novice teacher, 19 years old in the university, They're coming into the very first time. What are the very first things we want to get to them that they'll learn the most? That's what we've got here for the pillar practices. And then these embedded skills underneath help to support that implementation. Go ahead. We talked throughout this that trying to learn all 22 is a very heavy lift. And on the next slide, we really see it more streamlined. Go ahead, Devin Roethlisberger. Or type your question. Yeah, maybe we're not set up for that. I see your hand. Write your question in the chat, and we'll answer it that way. All right, so Tisa, you're going to now take everybody through the elements of the book.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Michael. So as we said in the beginning, we wanted to be intentional about culturally inclusive pedagogies and practices. So there's a very specific section of the introduction to really outline those recommendations and kind of the perspective that was provided by JT Taylor and Liz Harkins Monaco, who provide a lot of resource in this particular area, not just in shaping the introduction, but also providing recommendations throughout the text and in each chapter. I'm going to show you what we did specifically with that as I show you examples. So here's an example of one of the domains, instruction, behavior, and academics. All of the sections for the domains have a domain overview that gives you kind of that walkthrough of what the domain is, and to a degree, how this domain relates to other domains of practice and HLP. So for the most part, it's an introduction to the domain, while also providing a comparison as able to the original HLP framework with the updated framework so that you can see those side by side. In these domain overviews, we also were very intentional about defining pillar and embedded practices so that you just don't get that in the introduction at the beginning of the text, but that you get that in each of these sections to remind our audience of what those practices are, pillar versus embedded. And then also to remind us about what culturally inclusive pedagogies and practices are. So there should be a definition of CIP in each of the domain overviews, again, to reinforce the terminology that's being used throughout the text and the concepts. Okay, let me move forward. Okay, then once you get into the domains, you have, depending on the domain, you obviously will have either one pillar practice or two pillar practices in some instances, one embedded HLP or multiple HLPs, embedded HLPs. So some sections of the text are going to be lengthier than others and maybe structured slightly differently based on the fact that they may have one HLP, one pillar practice or multiple pillar practices or many embedded practices. So just look for that. Once we have, for all embedded and pillar practices, we provide that the language for the HLP as well as the description of that HLP. Remember, for the most part, the language or labeling of the HLP remain the same, with the exception of two HLPs. And the descriptions, for the most part, have all been updated. But there are some instances where the original description from the original 2017 text remained the same. In these sections of the text, you have a brief description of the HLP. In this section, you see critical features and connections to the pillar practices. This is specific to two of the domains that have multiple pillars. So this one had multiple pillars, and so the authors wanted to really tie each of the embedded HLPs back to the pillar practices. All of the chapters will have a cultural considerations section, but keep in mind the attention to SIP, the attention to culture and language did not remain in those cultural consideration sections. It's really woven throughout, but we were mindful in calling some of that narrative out. As indicated earlier, some of what folks wanted were examples of practice. And so each of these domain sections have examples in practice, both elementary and secondary. And that's also where you're going to see some integration and consideration for cultural and linguistic background, etc. Okay, so here we see the other half of that section, the secondary example, and then research support. In the original text, that section of the text was a little lengthier. Here, it's abbreviated. And what you'll see is that there could be even lengthier descriptions of the domain, lengthier descriptions of the HLP practices and the research support. But this text is really seen as a primer, just a beginner text to introduce you to the HLPs and to the reorganization. So the research support here is just the tipping point of what's out there and provides at the end of each section resources to implement the practices. The resources that are recommended are online resources, articles, texts, video, websites, so places for folks to go for additional information. And that's really important to pay attention to. And I'm going to show another slide at the end, those additional texts that have been published since the original HLP text have deeper, lengthier, more robust examples and information related to all of the HLPs. Again, this is the primer text that and the text that has now emphasized the reorganization. But those other texts that are recommended that I'm going to show another slide of at the end are wonderful, a wonderful complement to this and really where you want to go for those deeper, more robust examples of practice. And then every domain section has a putting it all together section. So at the end of the domain, the authors take the opportunity to talk about the domain and how it complements other domains of practice, other HLPs. Again, the cross-pollination. These are practices that complement one another, and you can't really talk about one without talking about the other. So the putting it all together section is really taking that opportunity to send that message and demonstrate the importance of the integration of practice. Then at the end of the text are the references for each, according to each of the sections and chapters. In the original text, those were at the end of each chapter. In this book, they're at the end of the book. So just keep that in mind. And then the glossary, as in the original text, the glossary, there is a glossary at the end to include some updated definitions, some new terms, and a reference or resource of where to go and where they're cited. Okay, so just a word about updated terms. There are some key updated terminology that we kept kind of a focus on. One was multi-tiered system of supports. It's system instead of systems. That was a clarification in this text. Paraeducator as opposed to paraprofessional. We used educators instead of specifying special education teachers. Again, to demonstrate this is effective practice for our general education colleagues and other specialists. So that's why we use the term educators, with the exception of the scenarios, the examples, we use teacher in those narratives. We used multilingual learners instead of English learners, specialized instructional support personnel instead of pupil services personnel, partners instead of stakeholders. CIP is our new term, culturally inclusive pedagogies and practices, intersectionality, and then defining, as I said before, pillar practices and embedded practices. Again, honing those particular terms across the text so that you could pick up and read a particular chapter and still understand what pillar and embedded practices are. So now what? We've talked about the original text and this new text, and we want to encourage you not to necessarily throw out the previous text. It does contain more information, particularly about the development of the HLPs that Michael talked a little bit about, kind of that journey of the initial development. You can read about that in the original text. And also reference it for the original research that was laid out in the original text. Again, we haven't done away with any of the HLPs from the original text. So now what? We have a new text or an updated, refreshed text. Now, where to go next? This is the slide that I was talking about of the other texts that have been published since the Primer 2017 HLP text, where you can go to take a deeper dive on all of the HLPs. So we have the high leverage practices and students with extensive support needs, HLPs for inclusive classrooms, and HLPs for intensive interventions. If you've purchased these texts, they are still relevant. I think we had somebody during convention who asked, did I just buy a book for my teachers that now no longer applies? Absolutely not. This is where you're going to go to learn more about each of the HLPs, because in this refreshed text, you're going to get a snapshot. You're going to get some information, but not a deep dive. And so here you will really get that, that depth, additional resources. You'll get to see recommendations of practice, templates, etc. So I would highly encourage you to go to these texts to supplement the refreshed text that we're talking about today. Another resource that we encourage folks to go to is cedar.org and the highleveragepractices.org for more information on the HLPs, including wonderful videos of Michael and his
I'm not in them. I made them. You got to hear my voice, but that's it. I'm not in front of the camera, thank goodness.
But where you could see it in practice. So it's, and it sounds like it's going to be continuously updated with more videos of the HLPs. Michael?
Yeah, and I want to draw your attention as well. I was texting with somebody in the chat a few minutes ago. There's so many free and high quality resources that have been created. A lot of them originate with OSEB. I want to call out the Office of Special Ed Programs within the U.S. Department of Education. They've been so forth-thinking about what do we need, what does the field need, where are we going? They've really been stirring the drink when it comes to the conversation around high leverage practices with their investments in CEDAR, their investments in IRIS, their investments that have shown up in other places that ultimately really support this work. So my work that has on my Vimeo page, they're all of the original HLP videos, but then so much more. Recorded lectures I've done and podcasts that my group have made. So please feel free to make use of this as you see fit. And like I said, I'm looking for partners to do some new filming, so we can feature folks from around the country doing really interesting things. So I hope to hear from you. I'll put my email in the chat.
Okay, so now what? For higher ed, folks who are in, who lead, teach in teacher training programs, you may look back to curriculum mapping and do a crosswalk with how the HLPs have now been structured in this restructure. Explore the resources in the new text and see how they can complement your coursework and what you have already. And perhaps even collaborate with other partners and state units doing this work in better understanding HLPs, and then understanding how to incorporate this new structure with the pillar and embedded practices into your existing program. For PK-12 school district settings, you want to perhaps look at the HLP refresh from this lens of the restructured HLPs. Maybe spotlight some implementation of teachers practicing the HLPs. Because sometimes it's just nice to see folks in-house doing the work, doing good work. And there's a lot of wonderful implementation happening that could be a source of professional development in-house for folks. You could run professional learning communities around the new text, and with supplements from the other texts and relevant chapters, and reach out for support with state providers, folks like CEDAR doing professional training with state units and districts, as an example. And so I think that is what we have. We want to make sure to open it up for, I'm going to stop sharing so we can open it up for questions.
It looks like Ashley Barnett is first.
Do we have audio? Do we know if we have audio? Is Amy,